can't tell you how thrilled I am to have so many people here today for our symposium, Program Governance, Governing Programming. I'll just do a brief thank you to Professor Alison Christians and Ignacio Performance, who are really responsible for bringing in these great panelists from academia and practitioners to help us discuss this issue, which I think, at least in terms of a law student's perspective, often combines the two perspectives between like fast-moving developments in technology and deep thinking in academia. So we're hoping that this panel today can help us sort of come to a little bit more clarity about how we can regulate some new technologies that we see and learn more about what those are as the panelists speak. And perhaps as the day goes on, you can also have a chance to share your own views during the comment section. So on that topic, I'll just talk a little bit about how the structure is going to work. We're going to have each speaker do a 10 to 12 minute presentation, and then we'll have commentators give them a couple of prompts, and then we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes of open question space after the presentation, after all the presentations are finished, where people can ask questions to each presenter as they go. So it will be all the presentations one after another, and then the question and answer. So I think with that said, there's only one more thing. If you're using Twitter, our hashtag is MLJ Symposium. First exponent, one of you, so that's everyone. Please do not forget that. And I think, yes, with that said, I think we're ready to get started. So our first presenter Roberta, Mann, and Moderator. So you're going to bring up my PowerPoint, right? It's up, so you can.
There we go.
Yeah, exactly.
So good morning, everyone. My name is Alexia Hefti. I'll be moderating the session today. I work as the blockchain tax lead at Deloitte. So I do international structuring for initial cleanup things and everything blockchain related. And I work with two governments, specifically Barbados and Uganda, on developing their blockchain and crypto regulatory frameworks. Today we have an amazing panel of professors and technologists to spur this discussion. So we really hope it's going to be a fantastic session. Right next to me we have Diane, Associate Dean of Faculty and Professor of Law at BC Law. She researches and writes primarily in the field of international taxation, corporate taxation, and ethical issues in tax practice. She focuses on information exchange, tax leaks, and international tax relations. Previously, she was a consultant of the United Nations on tax-based protection for developing countries. Shu-Yi teaches and writes in the area of tax policy and economic regulation. She is a professor at Boston College Law School and formerly was a professor at Tulane Law School. Her recent work focuses on innovations in the arena of human capital investments, as well as taxation and regulation of new industries such as the gig economy. Next to Professor Wu, we have Professor Roberta Mann. She's a professor at the University of Oregon School of Law. She focuses on how the tax system affects the environment. And she served as the only tax lawyer on the National Academies of Science Committee, studying how greenhouse gas impacts the Internal Revenue Code in the United States. She was also previously chief counsel to the IRS in Washington, D.C. We have next to Professor Roberta, we have Professor Mann, we have Marvin Coleby. Marvin Coleby is actually a graduate of McGill University in 2016. He articled at Denton's and thereafter moved to Kenya, Nairobi, Kenya, to set up RAISE, which is focusing on building out a security token platform, so focusing again on blockchain. Further, he is the founder of the African Digital Asset Framework, which we'll hear more about today, the first open standards and regulation in distributed ledger technologies. And finally, we have our commentator, Karen Eltis. And Karen Eltis is a professor of law at the University of Ottawa, focusing on innovation law, and is an affiliate at Princeton University's Center for Information Technology Policy. She is also on sabbatical from Hebrew University in Jerusalem, where she works with the university's cybersecurity center. Previously, Professor Ellis was at a law firm in New York. So we have today some incredible papers, and we're going to start first with Professor Mann's paper, I, Robot, New Tax, Considering the Tax Policy Implications of Automation.
Okay, thank you very much. I just need to correct one thing. I was not the chief counsel of the IRS. I worked in the chief counsel's office. I did. So I just want to make sure I don't get calls from people saying, you said you were chief counsel. No, I wasn't. So can we have the next slide, please? All right. So my paper is about how the coming wave of automation and artificial intelligence may affect both humanity and the tax system. And I'm going to focus on the tax system in the U.S. because I am a U.S. tax lawyer. So you may have to do a bit of translation if you're thinking about different tax systems. But this slide is illustrating the problem that I'm going to be addressing. So just review it at your leisure. All right, have we all absorbed this? Yeah. Do we have had coffee yet? Yeah. Okay, so next slide, please. So my presentation outline, and I have too many slides, so I have to do like 10 seconds on each one. So my first point is, what is a robot? And this is a point that Shu-Yi actually emphasizes may be a huge problem, which I don't necessarily, you're not, yeah, you have. Because you have to talk about what is a robot if you're going to talk about taxing robots, right? You have to define what it is. But this is not a problem, right? Because we're lawyers. We define things all the time. That's what we do. Next, I'm going to look at the two problems that may be caused by automation, which one is a revenue problem and the other one is a jobs problem. So the revenue problem is what is the coming wave of automation going to do for the revenue of the United States? And the jobs problem is, what is it going to do to people? And then I will look at some potential solutions. Okay, next slide, please. All right, what is a robot? Well, in literature, I loosely use the term literature, we may think about robots as sort of humanoid-type creatures that walk and that have arms and heads and things that look like eyes. But, of course, we know that that is not only what robots are, because robots do things like build Teslas. We have fully automated factories. We have semi-automatic factories. So when I define robot, which we can interchangeably use the word automation, as anything that can replace what humans can do. So, okay, so next slide. Automation. So, using this term interchangeably, this is a chart from the McKinsey & Company report, A Future That Works, Automation, Employment, and Productivity. And it may be too small for you to see, but basically the important thing is this little orange bar here, which says about 60% of occupations have at least 30% of their activities that are automatable. And so this may result in job loss. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is further drilling down into that concept, and this box here shows that the most susceptible activities to automation are collection of data, processing data, and predictable physical activities. And the McKinsey report, using the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, predicts that up to 2.7 million, did I say million? I meant trillion! $1 trillion of wages may be lost. And when you think about wages being lost, that translates to revenue being lost because people pay taxes. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a revenue problem because humans fund the tax system. So if you look at this chart, which is from 2016, you see that income tax in the U.S. is roughly half of the revenue that comes into the government. This other 34% is payroll taxes. Now, payroll taxes, you might say, well, you don't need that. That would be social insurance here, right? So payroll taxes, you may say, well, if we don't have people, we don't need payroll taxes because robots don't retire. You just, send them to be recycled or whatever. But nonetheless, in the U.S., although a previous presidential candidate, he probably was a presidential candidate before most of you were born, Al Gore, said that the Social Security revenues are in a lockbox they're not in a lockbox. In fact, the government has been spending them, so that 34%, you can say, well, that kind of, might still be there as well. Corporate tax, 9%, that's going down after the reduction in the corporate tax rates as of the end of last year. But also, do corporations pay tax? This is a Socratic question. All right, corporations are fictional, right? They don't pay tax, so who bears the burden of the corporate tax? Well, it's people. You might ask, which people? There's a debate about that. Is it the shareholders? Maybe you don't feel sorry for them because they're rich. But it could also be employees, so economists differ about that. And the revenue loss is estimated to be in the trillions of dollars from automation. These are some professors at the University of Surrey who wrote an article about this. And of course, that kind of makes sense because if you have $2.7 trillion in wages lost, you're going to have quite a bit lost in revenue too. And the next slide has a little example of how the revenue loss might work. So you have a human auto worker. The human auto worker might pay about $4,000 in income tax each year. One robot could replace 3 workers. The robot's going to cost more. It might last 5 years, that's what we assume. The robot itself is not going to pay taxes. And if we assume that the robot is roughly equivalent in terms of productivity to the 3 workers, we're not going to have any additional revenue coming in for the corporation or the business. So essentially it's $12,000 less annual revenue than a human. Multiply that as much as you want. To do that, robots also allow employers to avoid employment tax. Now what has happened? This is a concern that has come up worldwide. The EU considered a robot tax, but rejected the robot tax in February of 2017. South Korea reportedly has a robot tax, but it's not really. It limits tax incentives for investment in automation. Okay, so next slide. All right, here, of course, in Canada, you have, what is it, a GST here? Yeah, so it's basically GST, VAT. We don't have that in the US, but in the US, we do have sales taxes in some places. So humans pay sales tax, pay GST, increase profits for restaurants, grocery stores, and retail outlets. Robots, on the other hand, do not shop. So that's another problem. Next slide, please. Okay, so should we tax robots? This is Bill Gates. He's not a Luddite. Do you know what a Luddite is? Okay, and he says, yeah, we should tax robots. The robot companies aren't going to be outraged. There might be a tax. It's going to be fine. What people are saying is that the arrival of that robot is a net loss because of displacement. You ought to be willing to raise the tax level and even slow down the speed of adoption of these technologies. Okay, then Bill Gates' fortune is most likely a mix of luck and effort. It did not involve substantial investment by Bill Gates and therefore might best be described as mostly return to labor. Okay, Bill Gates said 2 of those things, not one of them. Which one did he not say? Okay, so he's not Donald Trump, so he does not use his own name when he's referring to himself. So that was the first one. It's not him, it's David Weisbach. He's a professor at University of Chicago. Okay, next slide, please. Do we have to tax robots? Okay, here's my big takeaway. No, we don't have to tax robots, but we should find revenue to help displaced workers. So why are jobs at greater risk now? Some people argue, no, jobs aren't. Automation has always increased jobs, but it doesn't increase jobs uniformly across the economy, and in fact, it can exacerbate income inequality. Okay, next slide, please. But wait, oh God, I hate this slide. All right, yes, unemployment is at historic lows, but actually, if you look at employment rates, which some economists say are more salient than unemployment rates, in fact, the employment rate, which is the ratio of employed persons to people of the age who would be employed in the economy, basically that has not changed. So we still have a lot of discouraged workers. Okay, next slide, please. How could the tax system help? It could help by changing labor or by changing taxation. So changing labor by subsidizing education and retraining, enhancing the earned income tax credit, or maybe creating government subsidized jobs. All of this needs revenue, right? We need revenue for that. Or it could change we could help it by changing taxation, changing the way labor and capital are taxed. Okay, next please. I don't know what this is. Oh yes, Capital. Why is capital taxed more lightly than labor? Well, it is taxed more lightly than labor, and how do we know that? Well, capital gains are taxed more lightly than labor income. And why is it taxed more lightly? Historically, taxpayers have a lot of control over the timing of the taxation. Capital expenditures may be taxed more lightly than labor income. In fact, because we now, particularly after the 2017 Tax Act, we have increased accelerated deductions for capital expenditures. Historically, capital expenditures were allowed a deduction, oh my God, I see this thing, over the life of the asset, and that is matching the spending on the capital expenditure with the income that comes from the expenditure. Now we allow those capital expenditures to be immediately expensed, thereby accelerating the deduction and increasing the tax benefit. Let's go quickly through the rest of these slides. Oh yeah, okay, so U.S. Tax Cuts and Jobs Act has actually made things worse. So let's continue. Let's see what's next. Oh my God, oh God, I thought I got rid of that one. Okay, continue. Okay, is universal basic income the answer? Well, it could be part of the answer, but people need work. People need work for social reasons as well as income reasons. Okay, Voltaire. What would Sweden do? I love what would Sweden do. Okay, they would create job security councils. The U.S. is not going to do this. And it's also interesting to see tax revenues as compared to percentage of GDP. Sweden tax revenues are 50.5%. US are 26% of GDP. Sweden has a lot more revenue to use to help workers. They want to help workers. What is the US doing? Next slide. Oh. Coal miners are so confident that Trump is going to save their industry that they are actually rejecting alternative career training. So that's what we're doing, and we're cutting corporate taxes, 1.5 trillion. Okay, I think I only have a couple more there. Oh no, this is the last one. Hello. Okay, so where are we now? Perhaps we're at the robot apocalypse.
Wait, I didn't finish reading this one yet.
Oh,
Okay.
okay. Okay, next. There we go. This is a show from the 60s.
What is that? What is that?
This is Lost in Space.
Oh.
This is Lost in Space. This is Robot. This is Dr. Smith. This is Will Robinson, who is trying to stop Dr. Smith from killing Robot with his sledgehammer.
Thank you, Roberta. Thank you.
So thank you, Professor Mann. Before we go into questions, we're actually going to go through each presentation so that we can bring discussion on all of these various topics that are very interesting. So thank you for that fantastic, lively presentation. We now have Professors Ring and Lee, who are going to present on a data council, next steps in international taxation information.
So I have been nominated by my co-author to formally present, but she will pipe in when she feels what I've said is not satisfactory. So to set this, this is tax, right? So this is more tax, which is very exciting. So I know you're this is how you start your morning. But to set it up, sort of introduce the problem, right? And the problem is countries around the world. So this is not a U.S. issue. This is a global issue. Countries around the world struggle with the following problem. They don't have enough information about their own taxpayers' assets, income, and activities outside their own jurisdiction. Right? And so why is that a problem? It's a problem because if you're a tax authority, you need that information to assess, to figure out what taxes might be owed, and then to enforce. Right? If the assessment hasn't been met, you need to go after it, but that's hard to do if you don't have information about both the assets, the income, and the activities. And why don't you have it? Well, the answers vary, but taxpayers, particularly humans, not so inclined to report. And they'll be hiding. Right? And on the corporate side, there tends to be a little less direct hiding. Multinationals tend not to actually engage in so much fraud, direct fraud. But maybe I might say they'd be disingenuous about their activities, assets, etc. So the bottom line is there's too little income being reported, too little tax paid, and then of course you have governments that have less money to do the other things you might think they'd want. Plus, if you're thinking about it from an equity perspective, those of us who don't have all sorts of offshore activities Our stuff is well known to the government. We do pay tax, and we're probably not the wealthiest. All right, so what's been the response to this? The problem has grown as taxpayers have had increased ability to have these offshore connections. That's been sort of 20 plus years that you've had a really increase in the capacity to do so. Technology's been a part of that. But what we've seen in the last 10 years, for a variety of reasons I won't really talk about now, but we've seen sort of an information revolution. And that's what sort of describe it as in our paper. And what we mean by that is a revolution among the countries of the world in terms of moving towards and committing towards paths of requiring information to be provided in ways it hasn't been in the past and shared across borders in ways that it hasn't been. And so that's really what the revolution is, new mechanisms for actually getting information about these offshore activities, income, and assets to governments. And it's been the product of politics, technology that makes certain things realistic on a large, large scale, and law. And so what we are looking at, or arguing really, is that yes, you've had this sort of revolution, and we're now actually starting this year, last year a little bit, this year going forward, starting to get much more of that information coming into countries around the world, that there's now a new issue. And the new issue is if you're actually going to have enormous streams of information coming, I'll talk more about what they are, into countries on an automatic flowing basis, the next question is sort of what happens when that information now arrives? You're so happy you've crossed the hurdle of getting it, what happens now that it's here? And the big way the problem question's been framed is this one of technology, right? And what we're suggesting is really, it's actually domestic politics. If you think about politics, law, and technology as sort of big drivers through all of this, so creating the revolution, when the data now comes home, it's been framed next as a technology problem, and we're suggesting it's really domestic politics. And in particular, whether domestic legal regimes are going to be able to control some of the risks that we outlined. So that sort of big picture start. Step back, right? If I'm a government, where do I get my information about you? Right? I want to tax you, and where do I get my information? First, I get it from you. You're compliant, you love your country, you file your tax return voluntarily, you hunt down that extra piece of information to report carefully, we love you. That's one. Second, third parties who don't love you and who are just happy to report so they don't get in trouble. Third, tax administrators who will investigate. Whistleblowers and media. That's probably not necessarily the low profile among us, but if you've got, say, cross-border accounts in Switzerland, leaks will show that. And then from other tax administrations, they may actually give us information. So those are your major sources of information. And then as I said, what do we do with that? We're determining your tax liability, figuring out what you owe. We're going to try to audit and enforce where appropriate. And then also we're going to use that to think about policy, which I think is lost sometimes. I mean, having better information gives us a chance to step back and think about what really should we be doing. Are there ways we should be changing the tax system itself, and perhaps the allocation of the tax base, et cetera? So the revolution, what are we now getting? I keep talking about 5 minutes, no. All right, so it's end products of the revolution. 2 big things we're going to see. Automatic exchange of all sorts of information about your offshore accounts, income, and assets, at least of certain types. And that is basically coming from third-party financial institutions, broadly defined. And basically, they're going to take that information, give it to their home country, which will then share it with the relevant taxpayer jurisdiction. That's the big picture of it. And as that information's flowing from the third-party financial institutions to their home jurisdiction, to the taxpayer's jurisdiction, what is the information? All sorts of personal identifying information. Because it does no good to know who you are in this country with a bank account if we can't figure out who you are in your real home country. So personal identifying information, all sorts of account or asset details, right? Or asset values, right? So that's roughly what it is. That's one package, the automatic flow of all that information. And then the second is what I would describe as enhanced corporate reporting. So for those of you who are already in corporate taxation, right? Country by country, right? And so you can think of it as countries around the world loosely agreeing as part of an OECD project that they're going to domestically sort of require countries to provide a sort of schedule of 8 pieces of information about activities in that country. And it might not seem like much, but the thought, given how much companies resisted it, that's always a clue. You know you're asking for the right thing when they don't want to give it to you. Right? So, and there are some good reasons why, and some perhaps not so good reasons why, but all sorts of information about revenue, earnings before tax, asset values, number of employees, and related party transactions. It's really trying to get a clearer picture about how multinationals are operating in different countries. Okay. I was going to talk a little bit about the path to that revolution that gave us these 2 new sources, but I'm going to put that off, we don't have time. So, as I said, our question now falls, what happens now that that's coming home? And as I said earlier, the dominant question as this is generally discussed is a technology problem, right? How is it that countries are going to manage so much data? Will they be able to use it, effectively? Right? Companies have a fair question. I do all this work, or businesses, I do all this work to get it to you, you just can't manage that much. Or you have trouble matching it effectively, et cetera. So lots of sort of issues there. But it tends to be framed as technology. What we're asking is that really much more a problem of domestic politics? And this is why. As that information comes home, 3 things are possible. Right? The first is we now have full comprehensive enforcement of tax laws. That's what we think is going to happen. Second, we could have a stalemate because remember, lots of people don't really want that information flowing, and they lost at the international global level as this debate was taking place over the past 5 to 8 years. But having lost at the global level, they can try again at the domestic level, right? And we talk a little bit more in the paper about how you could sort of use your domestic political power to maybe try to stymie resources going to your tax enforcement agency, and then other possibilities. So basically try to have a stalemate via the domestic political process. So the information comes in, but it kind of never really gets used. The third, perhaps the worst, right? You have this growing pile of data. Right? Each year it grows. Right? And we think it's for enforcement, and that's the idea. And we need it for enforcement. I mean, I think that's really, really a fair statement. But what else could you do with it, right? If you well, I don't know, evil, profit motivated, clever, right? And it doesn't have to be government. I mean, but there are lots of ways we sort of talk about how that might be used. And some of it could be internal to government, used by political parties, and you've got lots of different countries participating. In theory, the global mechanism for now having this revolution, sharing information, is try to put in place mechanisms to prevent abuse, but one has to look at that with caution. So we, and I think I'll end here, have 3 sort of questions that we're trying to work through here. Okay? Is existing law powerful enough to curb the impulses behind the sort of second issue, the stalemate, right? So is sort of the legal system enough to kind of withstand the political pressure not to use it to enforce the law? Second, does better technology, what we seem to have, and infrastructure, and that's really the infrastructure to use this much data flowing in so fast, does that better technology and infrastructure increase the risk of misuse? Right? So as you're better able to manipulate, organize, I mean, in some ways, if it's just a big pot of data you can't figure out what to do with, maybe no one else will either. But if you really are able to maneuver and get it organized in all sorts of interesting ways, does that, in fact, increase the likelihood of it being misused? And then the third is, once you have this kind of global system in place, and that's really a legal and a technology question, right? Once you have it in place for sharing all this information, is it hard to go back? Right? Can you ever really dismantle that process once you've gone down that direction? So not quite technology is the focus, but really technology is surrounding all the tax and legal questions.
Can I chime in on 2 quick things that I think are quite interesting to emphasize? One is the part you skipped over, which is the degree of like excitement and feeling of sea change at the kind of global level when these new revolutions came into place. Like, wow, this is a huge change. It's going to change everything, right? And then 2 is I think in my mind, a non-trivial part of the revolution was idiosyncratic leaks and hacks, right? It was, you know, stolen data or revealed data, right? That you know, just cast sunshine on what's happening, right? And then we get these new regimes. And then the third, in some sense, is the countries who are behind the new regimes, right? The sort of OECD, the US on the FATCA side, developed countries, right? Really pushing, right? Countries, you know, worry, Europe, right? We're worried about the tax base and how to raise revenue, right? But then now, because the exchange system is so multilateral, it's gone to everyone, right? And then I think that the part that we're trying to think through is, you know, when that data, you know, goes and goes to very heterogeneous uses in a way that's no longer multilateral, right? What the new set of issues are. So, yeah.
Thank you. So thank you so much to both. I think a lot of questions were raised at the end, which hopefully you all have the answers to. So we'll be turning to you at the end. We'll just go through the final presentation by Marvin on ADAP and what ADAP is doing. As a preface, because I am actually dealing with blockchain regulation in several governments, when ADAP was launched, was it last week?
Yesterday, 2 days ago.
2 days ago, wow, it feels like a long time ago. It kind of caused an absolute stir in the blockchain community, particularly as the blockchain community operates even with governments through WhatsApp and social media, because it's the first time that we actually saw blockchain being used, you know, within how we frame regulations. I'll actually let Marvin speak to that, but we're really excited about it in the community.
Thank you. Good afternoon, good morning, everybody. Who here knows what a Bitcoin is? Who's ever used a Bitcoin? That's you? That's good. That's good.
What? Really?
No one
It's
else
just you.
here.
Wow.
And that guy, just describe, Professor, describe a Bitcoin in 2 sentences. What is it?
It's a medium. It's a medium of exchange and a store of money.
Okay,
A store of value. Sorry. Yeah.
it is. So
It's money.
a Bitcoin, it's money. It's money, but it's what we refer to as a digital asset. So a Bitcoin is an asset that exists digitally that acts, in this case, as a currency. So I could take out my phone right now and I could send money from here to a mobile device in Malaysia or in Australia or in Singapore in the next 5 seconds and pay almost no money to do that same transaction. If anybody in here tried to go into their RBC or Scotiabank account, that would be almost impossible. You incur a lot of fees. Digital assets like Bitcoin allow us to transfer assets around the world almost instantly, securely, and directly between people. So from my phone, again, I could send it to someone, another person around the planet. So the properties of Bitcoin and digital assets lend themselves to be transferred around the world instantly between people. That's fundamental to what this technology represents for the world. That's extremely transformative because Bitcoin, again, is just one version of many kinds of digital assets. You can take any kind of asset, healthcare records, identities, currency, shares, stock, debt instruments, bonds, commodities, insurance policies, anything that you want that represents value, land titles. You can transfer digitally, securely, and privately around the world. What that represents is a dramatic transformation in how we see people trade directly between each other. So instead of having necessarily businesses and companies that trade between each other across borders, you'll have people that directly trade in peer-to-peer networks, if not already, and due to the sharing economy. So what that represents in a lot of ways is that digital assets like Bitcoin don't know what a border is. They would not exist, they were not created to know that they were in Canada or Malaysia or South Africa. They don't know the difference. Which means that the regulations that different governments create between themselves restrict the movement of digital assets across different jurisdictions. So I could take a Bitcoin from Allison, she could send it to me in Kenya, and in Kenya it's not considered legal tender. But if I take that same Bitcoin and transfer it in Japan it is considered legal tender. If I send it to Switzerland, I can pay tuition with Bitcoin. And if I send it back to Canada, it's not considered legal tender, and it has a different tax categorization. So the different regulations being developed around the world are presenting an issue to the movement of frictionless digital assets. So there's a need to create ways to harmonize those different regulations across different borders. In this case, in my paper, I present that the idea of frictionless digital assets that move across borders present a significant opportunity for peoples of common descent to trade between each other. That example is the diaspora communities. So in diaspora communities in Canada, for example, that send remittances back to Africa or any African country, typically the cost of sending remittances is about 10% more than any other jurisdiction in the world. Using a Bitcoin or digital asset of any kind, that transaction is less than a couple pennies. So right now you already have massive volumes of remittances that move back to jurisdictions like ours in the Caribbean and into the African continent. The idea of having assets that now make it almost instantly and easily transferable digital assets mean that the trade that can happen between those communities is significantly more than it's ever been in human history. But the problem is that the regulations between those different jurisdictions, between the Caribbean and diaspora communities and the African continent, are going to be different. So there's a need to develop standards that facilitate the regulations to be similar across these different jurisdictions. So the African Digital Asset Framework is intended to be an open source software, so a place online where people can come and present standards for these technologies. And those standards are meant and researched and built to be Pan-African. Pan-African in the sense that they are meant to spur trade and commerce on the continent, as well as between the diaspora communities around the world. The idea there is to develop what we are calling a digital trade network. So standards that are built to facilitate trade between the Caribbean, between Latin America, between Canada and North America and the African continent that facilitate trade of digital assets of any kind, not just Bitcoin. So in my paper, I spent a lot of time arguing when I was in McGill, I studied in trade finance under Dimitral, and the trade patterns of the world show that we've moved from multilateral organizations like the World Trade Organization to regional trade organizations and preferential trade agreements to now single digital markets. So the European Union has a European single digital market. The African Union has an African single digital market. And in those regional trade agreements that now exist, they're literally constitutions, tools, economic and political instruments that specifically create a way to trade assets between communities that exist around the world, specifically in the Pan-African context. So this paper argues that the only way of developing that and calibrating these rules across different regulations is to use these tools for regional trade under these organizations, the standards that are developed by people, not just governments, in an open source environment for digital assets and distributed ledger technologies, and are specifically measurable against tools for economic development in those communities. So a very practical, hopefully practical example of how this would work. Yesterday we talked about educational curriculum in law schools. How do you develop educational curriculums with technology? So on this platform, the African Digital Asset Framework portal, let's just call it the portal, you can have a class here that is specifically focused on healthcare technology, and at the end of the semester of that class, they come up with a 5-page document that specifically outlines how data protection for healthcare records could work for Indigenous communities in Ontario. That 5-page document can be posted on a website, and that 5-page document can be taken by any government in Canada, any federal, municipal, provincial government, and that PDF document formed the basis of research or development for a new policy that specifically creates technologies for distributed ledger technologies that host digital assets like healthcare records. The idea there being is that you take a standard created by people in a law school that is openly accessible to anyone in the world, and then taken by governments, taken by people, taken by community organizations or law schools, and implemented in how they make decisions. And that healthcare record application PDF document that was created in McGill was not created to be, in this case, created to be jurisdiction specific. It wasn't meant to exist only in McGill. It was meant to exist as a policy that facilitates the development of digital assets for healthcare across Canada, which means that when it's implemented by different governments, it's implemented in such a way that it creates almost like a regional approach to a similar thing. The idea there is you're trying to calibrate and harmonize rules across different jurisdictions such that people get to use technologies and not siloed. And I return to what I said again, digital assets don't know what a border is. They were not built to know what a border is. So if you have different governments developing different regulations, they restrict the potential for this technology to bring change for people's lives, as well as they significantly augment the disadvantages that these technologies will bring to our societies. So my paper argues specifically we need an open source framework to develop standards in line with the principles of the rule of law that is not westernized, specifically to develop digital trade networks for Pan-African economic prosperity within the continent and among the diaspora. Thank you very much.